Welcome to our new video series, How to Make Your Life Count. It's a little bit different than almost every video series you see out there on the internet, because we're not here to try to help you become a millionaire. Not that being a millionaire is a bad idea. I studied success quite extensively as I went through my life, and I know a lot about it. I'm not a millionaire, but I'm very successful. I'm a father of 12 children. I have seen them all take on things that they wanted to do, live their life. They all have had jobs, and yet jobs do not define them. Often when guys get together, that's the first question they ask is, what do you do? And we really take a lot of definition in our culture from the things that we do that keep our food in our bellies and our clothes on our backs and our roof over our heads. But I'm sharing with you in this video series a little bit about a different kind of success. I really want to make you aware of how to make your life count in a way that when you die, you don't, I don't know anybody who says on their deathbed, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. I wish I'd spent more time pursuing the things that made me money. Because money at that point has very little relevance. You don't, other than a scorecard, it makes no difference. And so it's a good way to keep track of, how well you're doing in certain aspects of success in life, but not for everything. So what we want to do with this series is to give you some principles, some things that are valuable and worth your time that don't necessarily lead directly to your pocketbook. Now, I will tell you that success doesn't have boundaries. If you learn to be successful in one area, it doesn't stay there. It does cross the areas, or tend to cross the areas. But money's an interesting thing. When I tell you I'm not a millionaire at the moment, that doesn't mean that I haven't run $1 million companies. I have. But I learned one thing about money, is it's a wheel. It doesn't stay in any one place for eternity. It just doesn't happen. There's that sense in which if you hoard it, you get enough to go on with things. But I'm a gambler. I tend to roll the dice when it comes to some things. Some things, like I said, gambling is not a success principle, by the way. I should probably point that out right away, that it's not. And gambling, as far as I'm concerned, is not something I would ever do at a casino and risk anything. I just wouldn't do it. It's not important to me. The gambling I do is with things like when you have to make a choice between two things and you don't know whether or not one thing or another is going to be good, you take a risk. And it's a reasonable and a calculable risk. So when I was in California, I ran a movie company, but to do that I had to basically go all in. So we risked a lot. When that company folded, the possibility was, if I protected myself right, which I knew how to do, I would not have owed anybody anything, and I could have walked away with a lot of the money and kept it in my pocket, and people would have said, that's smart. I didn't do that. I chose to pay people back and have nothing at the end. So in a way, a few years ago, I started over again. And yet, I have no fear of finances. I know that the money will be there when I do the right things to bring it back. So I don't come to you from a place of, having a Lamborghini in the garage, or, things to say to you that, oh, well, this is all going to be fine. Money happens very quickly. I've heard people say that you can't get rich quick. I've heard other people say that it's the only way to get rich, and that's probably true. Money does come very quickly when you do the right thing. So it takes time, it takes seed God never made a seed that was going to harvest the next day, right? You don't plant it and come back and dig it up looking for your apple tree. It just doesn't happen that way. It's going to take sometimes years to develop the right kind of crop. And so what I want to do is to encourage you today to be planting the kind of crop that you're going to be happy with at the end of your life. That you're going to be able to say to people, you know, I have been successful. Whether or not it's finances or something else, that's the marker or the scorecard that keeps track. I want you to be able to look at somebody and say, I mattered, I counted. This made a difference in people's lives and I feel good about who I am. Not that your feeling is that important either, because for me, at any rate, I am a believer in God. I believe that He made me for a purpose, and He made you for a purpose, and that purpose was unique, and it was not going to be something that anybody else could do. It's going to be something that you alone can be successful at. And so the idea that, you know, it's a crowded world and lots of people are in my niche market, or too many people are doing what I do and it's just not that important, that's just not true. God knows why He made you. He put you here for one very specific reason, that He knows what it's supposed to be and you don't. And your job, I think, more than anything else, is to discover that reason. Not to invent it, not to create it, although it will involve your creativity. But it's more about discovery of who you are. And it's more about making sure that in the end, you have a story worth telling. You see, everyone has a story. And everyone would like to tell their story. And you would like to believe that it matters. And so we're going to talk about storytelling today, primarily, in the hopes that this helps you really understand who you are and why you're here and what you can offer to the world. And in telling your story, there are people who need your story. I want to tell you a story about Robert Louis Stevenson, phenomenal writer, born in 1850. Just an interesting character. You see, he wrote some of the most fabulous books. And yet, if you read the originals, they're written for adults, they're not really written for children. And yet his books and his stories are loved by children the world over. Interesting character, because he was born with a very weak chest. He developed a kind of infection in his lungs that never left him throughout his life. He only lived 44 years. Had a very tumultuous life. His father was a lighthouse engineer, and that's what been in the family for generations. They were lighthouse builders, and so they traveled on the sea to remote islands, from the very far north of Scotland to the fact that they had a permanent home in Edinburgh. So here Robert is born into this household in the capital city of Scotland, and yet he spends a lot of time traveling with his father, and he spends a lot of his time in bed. At 7, he tried to go to school. It didn't work. He wasn't well enough. Every time he would go, he would get fevers and chest problems, and he would have difficulty breathing and coughing, and he would end up back in bed. And as a child confined to bed for most of his life, he actually struggled with this illness, and for most of his growing up life, till he was maybe 23, he fought seriously with these illnesses and was practically bedridden until he was 11. During this time, he wrote a book called A Child's Garden of Verses. You know, his father really wanted him to be a lighthouse engineer. He tried. He studied that for a bit. Then he decided not to do that, but to become what was called in those days a man of letters, to become an author. And as an artist, anyone who's ever been an artist, you know what that kind of life is like. Not necessarily the most lucrative all the time kind of situation. Fortunately for Robert, he was well accepted during his lifetime, and he did become independently able to continue his travels. And actually, most of his travels were searching for a place that would not hurt him to breathe. And so he ended up settling in Samoa. And that he spent years looking for that place because it was a place where he could have enough heat and enough dry air that he wouldn't bother him. So it was a place that he spent his last days. Interesting because as an English author, he moved far away from his audience. He moved, and yet he continued to write stories throughout his life. He wrote some very classic things. He wrote things like Kidnapped and Treasure Island. He wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Strange Case of, and books like that. As a poet, he wrote A Child's Garden of Verses, absolutely delightful stuff for children. And his books, like I said, are full of adventure and the kind of life that he wishes he could live, but couldn't. Aside from his travels, he really, mostly on the sea, he really didn't have much to experience in his lifetime because of his illness. The experiences he did have gave him ability to create in his imagination these absolutely fantastic, adventuresome, hero-type stories. The Black Arrow is another one. That one got me when I was a child. I loved that story. That was one of my favorite books. And Master Ballantrae and others. I mean, the guy was just amazing. David Balfour was the subject of his book Kidnapped. And yet, you see him drawing on life experiences, but you see how limited they were. You see, Balfour was his mother's maiden name, and many of the other names that he came across or that he worked with were relatives. They were uncles or cousins or people. He had a cousin Bob, but he had an Uncle David and an Uncle Alan. And both these names pop up in his stories because this is his limitations on the world. But his limitations were expanded as he looked out of his bedroom window on the sky. He didn't just see clouds. He saw sailing ships that took him away to various places. His imagination could go where his body could not. And so we have a story of a man seriously limited that some people would say, what's the purpose? He's born sick. He lived sick. He died early. What could he give the world? What could he do that was different? And yet he did. He made a mark that was significant and lasts to this day. Well, from 1850 till now, that's a good stretch. Yet it's not the biggest stretch. Let me tell you another story. There was a young boy, born seventh in his family, not really supposed to be anything. As a matter of fact, he was given a job to take care of the family sheep. Not really a big deal. Send him off into the field somewhere. He's not going to amount to anything anyway. His 6 older brothers, by the way, were all good-looking and strong men, and men of renown, people who went and became somebody. One of them became the captain in an army, and was very prominent in the culture. But this kid, there was something about him. Although he was stuck back away with the sheep, he honed his skills with some weapons to protect those sheep and managed to kill a lion and a bear and did some things that seemed to be a little unusual for a shepherd boy that wasn't supposed to amount to anything. One day he had a visit, and the visitor actually showed up at his father's place and took a look at all of his 6 older brothers and said, "It's not why I'm here. I'm here because God sent me to choose a king." And he went through all 6, and none of them worked, but God had sent him to that family, and so The father, kind of as an afterthought, thought, well, there's always David, but he's over there with the sheep. I mean, he won't be the guy. And yet King David is probably the most recognized of all Jewish kings of all time. David was the seventh son, a guy that nobody thought would count. And yet, he did. For some strange reason, he wrote the best-selling songbook in the world. It's lasted thousands of years. It's contained in the Bible, which is why it's probably the best-selling songbook in the world. But he wrote the Psalms, by and large. I mean, there were a few other people that contributed. But David is primarily the author of those songs. So to be the best-selling songwriter of all time, that's pretty good credentials. Songs that lasted thousands of years. What about you? What about you? Are you nobody? Are you a David stuck back with sheep? I don't think so. I don't think that's why God made anyone. I think he made everyone to be the best them they can be. Our goal in this video today is really to teach you, or to show you at least, a way in which your story can count. Your story needs a voice. Your story needs to be told. I have a story. I'm a songwriter, a speaker, in spite of my voice. For those of you who are wondering, how does a songwriter, musician, singer end up sounding like this? I had a stroke, and it has sidelined me from that career for a little bit. I will come back. I will get all the way better, but in the meantime, you're stuck with this. And it's my content that I hope is compelling. It's my content that I want you to sort of get onto and realize that, yes, I have a special interest in songwriters, and therefore the story of David is very important to me. And the idea that God can take somebody from nowhere and make them into something, that's also important to me. So I want you to track with me on this, because we need to understand a few things about our story. The first thing about our story is that it's not random and it's not accidental. If you look at the things that you've been through in your life, you have an audience somewhere. You have a tribe somewhere. Someone who needs what you've been through to inspire them. If a sickly little boy, or a boy disregarded to be sent to watch sheep because he wasn't fit for, the kind of prestige everybody else in the house had, the seventh son, the afterthought, could be significant. Then you, regardless of your circumstances, have a destiny to fulfill. Because the same God that made them made you. And that same God has a purpose for you that's as important to him as the life of any other individual. So no human being is ever going to impress God with who they are. But we can live up to what God planned for us, and it's up to us to discover that. So I believe that your story is important. I believe that your story needs to be told. And that's why we're visiting today. That's more of a visit than a seminar. You notice that. I'm not really fit to be teaching a seminar, so I figured we'd just sit and talk. And in that process, hopefully, you get enough really good stuff that it's going to do you better than watching a seminar. Anyway, if you have a story, you need an audience. That audience is being prepared even as you're being prepared. And so what you have to realize is that whatever your story in your life is that needs to come out, that needs to come to the surface, you have to realize that it will be a part of a team. What do I mean by that? I want to speak to you for a minute as an artist, because the nature of art has always intrigued me as I write songs, as I paint things, as I tell stories, as I do some create some drama and acting and all of the other things that I've done in my life, public speaking, all of these things, they have two real aspects. There's what I intend to communicate, because art is dependent, really good art, even your story, your life as art, as God's art, is being created around your perspective in the world. It's not meant to be an absolute truth. Art is not absolute. It's one of those things that what you see is what you convey. And that's always the case. That's always true. And it's a very important thing to do, that you communicate art in a way that is attractive to the audience. So this is another part of art. And this is very important to understand, really the second big thing. If the first part of art is your perspective, then that's great. But when you put art out there, it is received by people with a different perspective. And so as you see things in life, and you reflect on them, and you try to communicate that perspective to people, understand that your perspective is not what you're actually communicating. But you're actually communicating a combination of what your perspective adds to life and what their perspective brings to the table as your team or your audience. And if you understand that your audience is a part of the creation of the value of what you have added to the world, and they're an essential part of it, you understand why every audience is a part of your team. So that's our primary job then. If we're realizing that our life is a piece of art, it needs to be attractive to an audience. I can just hear the people right now, some people saying, well, I'm not a handsome person, or I'm not a pretty person, I don't have this skill, or I don't have that skill. You know what? Those may all be truths in your perspective, and yet they're not really true. There have been people who have been severely handicapped, who do not appear beautiful by any stretch of the imagination, who end up being some of the most beautiful things in the world. You know, the Bible has an interesting thing to say about Jesus, is that he had it says in the King James says, has no form or comeliness that we should desire him. What that means is that he wasn't good looking and he wasn't very fit. I mean, he just looked like an average Joe at best, and at worst, somebody that was pretty ugly. And yet, he attracted 12 people to him, and he attracted crowds when he spoke. But it wasn't the physical things that let you perceive Jesus. It was different. It was attractive for different reasons. So no matter what your current state of physical reality is, the attractiveness you develop is going to be based on the art of God. It's going to be based on your story. It's going to be based on your contribution. It's going to be based on the impact you make in the world. So this impact is something that we want to develop consciously. We want to be able to say, I have been everything I was supposed to be. I have become the person I need to be. I am a success as I die. That's very, very important. So if I'm leaving you with anything on that story or that group of stories today, it's the importance, number one, of developing your story in a way that gains an audience. Well, the audience is a part of the team that's necessary, but it's not the only part. See, no one develops their story in a vacuum. No one develops it without help. God, of course, gave us the first help in the fact that he set us free to be who we should be through his own act, through the sending of his son, Jesus Christ. That's important to me, and it may not be important to some other people. It doesn't change the principle. The principle stays this, that you are developing this story, and you're not going to do it in a vacuum, but you have to have a team. And so part of how you make your life count is the development of, number one, the content, the story itself, and two, the team that is going to contribute to what that story is and then who that story is for. So those are two very, very critical things that we have to keep in mind as we look at making our life count. So how do you do this? How do you go about it? You're stuck in the watching the sheep, if you will. You're not really doing anything that's putting you on a fast track for having such a great story to tell, or needing to tell that story, or whatever. Well, the first thing that happens is that you have to become part of the audience. The first thing that you have to do in paying attention to developing your story is to see what role you're playing in helping other people develop their stories. This is perhaps the thing that's going to endear you to the most number of people in your lifetime, is the way you make contributions to the stories of others. It seems counterintuitive, because if you realize that your life is about developing your story, you think, well, I shouldn't be developing anybody else's story, then I should be developing my own. But that's actually backwards. The way our story develops, the way our story becomes relevant, the way our story finds a tribe or anybody willing to listen to us, it's by the things that we discover matter to us, by the contribution we make to the stories and the value of the lives we see around us. You see, when we look at people and dismiss them, oh, they're just that, they are handicapped, or they are not wealthy, or they are socially not my equals, they don't even speak the language properly, or they're immigrants, or they're anything else. When we dismiss people, we undercut our ability to develop our own story. This is very, very important. So paying attention to other people is something that endears our tribe to us. Paying attention to causes that matter. Paying attention to things that are out there that you have not yet discovered are actually your passion. And the problem we have, of course, is living to ourselves. One of the big problems we have is that once we know that we're supposed to be developing a story, once we know that that's the way we make an impact, a lot of people try to make the impact before they're ready. You see people developing YouTube channels and getting online and saying, I don't have an audience, but boy, I'm going to find one on the World Wide Web. You know, it's a big place and I can go to the whole world this way. And let me tell you this, the internet is a place that will multiply your efforts and make more valuable the things that are valuable. But it's not a place to develop something of value. So here you are online finding me, and you're looking at that, and is that something of value or not? Well, the answer is yes, it's valuable, because what you're doing is you're plugging into an amplification of a story I'm bringing to you. It's a story that let me put it this way. There are ulterior motives to everyone in every action and everything that we do. God knows that there are good motives and bad motives in everything. Guy sees a girl and he decides to get married. Well, that's a good motive out of something that could have been a bad motive. And still, if he's honest, he will spend the next bunch of years of his life being married, knocking off the bad motives that were part of his marriage. I think getting married is a wonderful thing. I think also there are things that, reasons people get married that aren't wonderful. And that's just the truth. And that's just one aspect of life. I mean, in everything we do. You know, there are people who write big checks to charities. Is that a good thing? Well, sometimes it's a wonderful thing. Sometimes it's the way they can speak, because it's what God gave them out of the development of their story to contribute to other people. And yet, sometimes the motives are, I need to do this because I need to be seen as somebody who's doing well. Maybe not such a good motive. I don't know. Is it there because it's making the person feel good? Is that a good motive? I don't know. Does a person need to feel good? Then maybe it is. Maybe that person needs to not so much worry about his feelings. Maybe that person needs to get a little more concerned about the people he's giving to rather than how he feels about giving? I don't know. But we all have mixed motives. Sometimes those motives are good. Sometimes those motives are bad. God's promise to us is that he will work all things together for good if you love him. As long as you're focused on the right person, the one who made you, then, that's who we develop our story for. We gotta stop thinking about the audience we are attracting in terms of the people and worrying about what God thinks of our story. That's a big deal. If we're worried about what God thinks of our story, we know that God sees all of our motives. We know that this could be something pretty seriously good. So we live our lives. We take each step as it comes. Some people look at their lives and they think, I am so busy. My life is just a mess of things. I've got no time to develop any kind of story. I have no time to do any of these things. I can barely keep the wolf away from the door. And so they view their life as a juggling act, and they're always throwing a ball and catching a ball, and there's always something in the air, and they're always worried about that. God has an interesting statement. He says, casting all your cares on him, for he cares for you. So what does God want when our lives are busy? He doesn't want us juggling those balls. He wants us passing those balls to him, right? He'll catch them. He'll hold them away from us until such time as we're ready to catch the ball. So the only thing we ever have to worry about in the development of our story, the only thing we ever have to worry about in the development of our life is one thing at a time. See, God's holding the rest of it. So if we just keep taking all of the things, all the confusion, all of the different stuff, and we literally hand it to God and say, you take it for a while. I'm done with this. What do you want me to do right now? And just be obedient. Just do that one thing. There are books written about the one thing, about how you get things done in your life, and yet you see them do all these things. You see them not accomplish one thing, but accomplish thing after thing after thing, and you think, how did they do that? Well, it is about many things, and it's about one thing. It's about one thing at a time. It's about learning how to let go of everything that doesn't matter and doing in the moment the one thing God has given you to do for now. Okay, so how does that lead to a story? How does that help me with my overview of understanding? How does my life count? Your life counts because you're not the architect. God is. And if he's holding all the balls, he knows exactly where they fit. So my encouragement for you today to make your life count, number one, is to start to trust your maker. To start to trust the one who has it designed, knows what it's there for, and will give you the ultimate story in your hands. So you're not responsible then for the ultimate content, except for your choices that you make through the way. Those are important, those choices. But the content is really up to the one who designed you, who will develop the most perfect, the most beautiful, the most wonderful story in the world. And it'll be your story. My mixed motives are kind of unique. I am a musician that I'd love for you to discover my songs. Well over 2,500, I don't know, somewhere close to 3,000 by now, I guess. I basically average about 50 some songs a year because I write at least once a week music. Now, since my stroke, it stole my voice, and I've had more difficulty with that, and I've averaged more like 2 a month instead of 1 a week, but that's an average. That's what happens. And it's interesting because I've gone back like Robert Louis Stevenson. I've gone back to writing some poetry again, rather than trying to set it all to music that I have difficulty communicating. But anyway, I'm in the process of mixing actually 4 discs right now. 1 double album and 2 individual albums, and they're all songs that I'd either had a hand in or had a hand in the lives of the people that are bringing those songs to you, and I would love for you to get your hands on that. And full disclosure, at the end of this video series, I'm going to give you the opportunity to buy some things, but the video series itself is not here to sell you. The video series itself is to communicate these vital concepts to your life so that you can get right. And when you have your life right, it's amazing how things come together. And so, to encourage you to continue to develop your content is something God will develop in you if you let Him, and you just pass the balls to Him and just do the one thing that you have in front of you at a time, and you are doing the right thing. You're focused. You understand. At the same time, the development of a team is something that you're tasked with, and so to have the best story in the world and to have nobody ever discover it is not a good thing either. And so how you begin to develop that team is to become a part of someone else's team. And so that's the second point I leave with you. First is your content matters. Second is your team needs to be developed, and you do that by joining a team, not by forming a team. Forming a team is a challenge, and it can be done sometimes easily if it doesn't matter, and sometimes with great difficulty if it does. And so why do I say that? Because usually what happens is you'll find somebody put up a YouTube channel and get real famous real fast and become a big influencer about things like makeup or commenting on songs or whatever. Does it matter? Well, perhaps. But it's the content that develops while you do those things that matter. So what I want to tell you about the internet is that the internet is simply an amplifier. If you join the internet before your content is well developed, you're joining the noise. Anybody notice that there's a lot of noise out there? We tend to gloss over so many people, so many stories, so many good things because we get caught up in the noise. We realize that there's too much noise, I just have to shut it out. And so we do. We turn it off. We ignore it. It goes by too quickly. We don't perceive value because so much noise. So when you're adding noise and not value, it's not helping your life make an impact. For your life to count, for you to be a success, you need to realize that the amplification of the internet is best when the content is developed and the tribe around you believes in similar things. So your tribe that you're out there developing while you're helping other people develop their stories, while you're noticing, while you're paying attention, while you're adding value to others, is that they reciprocate. It's a very human and psychological reaction that when someone gives us something, we tend to give back. When people ignore us, we tend to ignore back. It's called reciprocation. Whatever is done to us, we tend to do. Jesus had a different idea. He said, pray for those that despitefully use you. Do good to those that hurt you. Turn the other cheek. He talked about not reciprocating on purpose. When you don't reciprocate, it's very, very noticeable if those reciprocations were negative. When you reciprocate in a positive way, others reciprocate with you. And it is amazing what develops, and the story that develops eventually, and the impact that your life will make will largely depend on a process of team building, becoming a part of a team, and forming a team. People will join your team because they have seen what you have done with others. Leadership is always about following examples. It's not about being the boss. People are bosses without being leaders. Sometimes leaders exist in the rank and file of any organization, and people know who they are because these are the people seek out for help. These are the people that people will go to and say, you know what, I'm struggling with this. Could you show me how you do it? Leaders are quiet doers, but they lead by example. And so, our first job, if you want to develop a life worth living, to develop a life worth talking about, to develop a life worth having an impact at the end, is this. We learn to lead by learning to follow. We cannot build a team. We cannot make an impact. We cannot do great things with our lives without becoming a part of great things, without leaning on the understanding of someone else designing your content that's bigger than you or that you can even think or imagine. And so I love you. I'm glad I've been able to spend a little time with you today. I hope you found this video helpful. I'm going to ask you to do 3 things now. Number 1 is I'm going to ask you to respond to me. I'm going to ask you to tell me if you enjoyed the video and if the content was valuable to you and to your process at your point in your life. Tell me that. Tell me what you want to see me talk about, because I'm going to do a series about your life and about your impact. So if you can give me some questions to address in these chats, I will do my very best to work them all in. So if you'll respond, that would be great. All right, so we're wrapping up today, and we'll hope to see you in the next video. But I need to tell you that each time you perceive a new milestone, you also perceive questions. So the question I expect to be probably the most common is, where do I find my audience? I have, put out great content. I'm an artist, or I'm a songwriter, or I'm a writer, or I'm an author, I'm a speaker, and yet I can't seem to attract the people I need to attract. Well, we're going to talk about that next week, and we're going to look at more in depth of where to find your audience. Now, if you have questions, of course, I will try to work those in somewhere in a video series. So whether or not it's next week or not, I don't know, but we'll see. Or next time we do this. I don't even know if these things are going to come out a week apart, but we're going to be recording several versions of these sessions every week, and then we'll be able to space them as we see fit. Keep the date November 8th in mind, because that's going to be significant, and that's what we're gearing we hope to draw our video series will conclude by then, by the very latest, because November the 8th is the day that I want you to commit to something. So we're gonna look at what we're gonna offer you, and we're gonna look at the whole package and all the different potential. So we'll see you in the next video.